Hello, everyone, and welcome to our webinar today. Thank you for joining us. My name is Jeremy Keespier, and I lead strategic partnerships and business development at Renoster. I'm really looking forward to our conversation, where we'll be discussing how corporate buyers can better assess, manage, and mitigate risks when purchasing carbon credits, as well as how developers can de-risk their project to scale investment. We're pleased to have Claudio Braidotti, Chief Investment Officer at CarbonPool. Claudio leads the investment team at CarbonPool and is responsible for building and managing the high-quality portfolio of credits that underpins the claims payments. He has over 20 years of experience in the insurance industry, holding strategy, investment, and CFO positions. He holds an MBA at Anderson School of Business from UCLA and a degree in engineering from La Sapienza University of Rome. Joining from Renoster, we have our co-founder and chief science officer, Elias Airy. Elias is a remote sensing specialist with deep expertise in satellite imagery, LiDAR, and AI to assess forest carbon projects. You may know him from his YouTube channel, where he simplifies complex carbon topics, combining academic rigor with industry expertise, as well as a few hot takes. Elias holds a PhD and MS in forest resources and remote sensing from the University of Maine. We'll begin today's webinar with a brief presentation from Claudio to share a bit about CarbonPool's work, give an overview of how carbon insurance works, and key considerations for buyers. We'll then have a conversation with Claudio and Elias, digging into risk and insurance, and we'll be sure to save 15 to 20 minutes at the end for Q&A. So please drop your questions in the Q&A box below. We also have Catherine, our head of ops at Renoster, helping out with the back end of the webinar and fielding questions for the Q&A. And without further ado, over to you, Claudio.
Hello, everyone, and thank you, Jeremy, Elias, and Catherine for having me on. I'm Claudio Braidotti, the Chief Investment Officer at CarbonPool. I'm an insurance person, having spent 11 years in Allianz before joining CarbonPool last year here in Zurich, Switzerland. So I'll spend a few minutes showing some slides that will be relevant to our discussion today. I'll start with presenting CarbonPool, the carbon insurer that pays in carbon. We were founded by executives from Allianz and AXA and include forest scientists and climate scientists. Our mission is to de-risk carbon projects by providing in-kind insurance. And we do that by holding carbon credits with which we pay our claims. So in the next slide, we see carbon projects, also most well-run, have some residual risks. We insure them through a three-stage process, whereby we first collect externally relevant data on the project and the project area. Then we assess the hazards and their impact on the sequestered carbon. And finally, we build a statistical and actuarial model that allows us to quote a price. And this price is basically the cost of making sure that the credit is real and permanent. For a well-run project, these prices come out between 0.5% and 1.5% of the value of the underlying credits. So this is CarbonPool. Now, on the next slide, we start with a bit of general information for our discussion. There are several risks to a carbon project, such as a nature-based one, and I will focus on nature-based removal projects because they are the ones that at the moment can really provide some scale. There are certain risks before the forest is even established, and you can read them on the left. There are other risks during the growing phase, while the carbon is being captured and then measured, verified, and issued. And then there are other risks once the credit has been issued and maybe even retired, and for the following 40, 60, 100 years, as long as the credit is meant to last. All of these risks can be prevented, or at least mitigated by the project, but even the best projects will have some residual risk that they need to manage. On the next slide, we have one key way to manage these residual risks, which is by pooling them in a portfolio. This is a key service that insurers provide to the market, because if a sufficient number of risks are pooled together, then the idiosyncratic risk, that is the part that is specific to one particular project, the stroke of bad luck, if you like, this can be much reduced. But not all risk can be mutualized away, and there remains a part called systematic risk. This can be calculated, and insurers absorb it through their risk capital. This calculation is extremely important, and this is why we have insurance regulators who make sure that insurance companies do it properly and have sufficient risk capital to absorb it. Now, on the next slide, I have most of the risk that we saw earlier, and against it, I have their insurability. And you can see that most of these risks, which can benefit from diversification, can even be insurers. Insurers can cover them already today, or at least in good part. The only risks for which little can be done are entrepreneurial risk, as well as willful acts like fraud and negligence, but that is quite normal in other sectors too. So every insurable risk can be insured in the carbon sector, just like in any other sector. And finally, I have another 2 pages showing the effects of climate change on project risk. This first page shows an example of a project which we have quoted. And on the left-hand side, you can see how the risk of fire for that particular project in that particular area increases during the lifetime of the project. Already by the time in 20 years when the project ends, there is a clear uptick in fire risk. And this uptick becomes more and more important in the period between the crediting, at the end of the crediting, and the project end, which is during the time when the project needs to keep the carbon sequestered. For this particular project, climate change does not really have a big impact on the wind speed. This is the graph that you see on the right-hand side. But this is specific to this project. And clearly it is specific to the geographical position of this project. Now, if you put all the geographical positions together, and this is what we have on the next slide, at CarbonPool, we've run an analysis and determined location by location which areas will become more suitable for nature-based projects and which will become less suitable due to climate change. A map such as this, so the green is more suitable, the red is less suitable. A map such as this can have several uses. In the long term, you can decide, for example, where to start a new project, but even in the short and medium term, where you already have a project somewhere, you can understand which are the risks that will increase due to climate change and take appropriate mitigating actions within the project itself. So this is it from me for the moment. I hope I've whetted your appetite a bit on the discussions that we will be having.
Beautiful. Thank you for that context, Claudio. So from the questions we received on LinkedIn, as well as our conversations with folks, it seems clear that insurance is gaining momentum in the VCM as buyers look to de-risk investments, but there's also varying levels of sophistication and experience among buyers. So I guess in terms of thinking about risk, I'm curious what you think most buyers may be overlooking and what is one risk that may be getting too much attention?
Shall I start? So
yeah, please.
I think that, so here I'll take the perspective of the end buyer, so the buyer who will retire the credits. One risk that I believe buyers overlook is reversal risk. So even after issuance, the climate impact of the credits could very well reverse. Now, today, many corporate buyers basically sweep this under the rug. On the one hand, they do not have sufficient incentive to manage this risk. On the other, they appeal to the myth that the registry buffer pool has made those credits permanent. Now, we've already published a white paper and ran a webinar together with Elias. And if you haven't seen those, I urge you to go and look them up. The point is that registry buffer pools are fundamentally flawed. They are insufficient, they are unregulated, and they do not adequately manage their portfolio. The real answer to making a carbon credit permanent is to insure it against reversal. And this is also true for technological risks, because even those can suffer from damage and leak the carbon dioxide back out into the atmosphere, as we have seen already happen. Now, this is the risk that is overlooked, reversal. On the LinkedIn poll, the result that I have seen is that there is a lot of concern for modeling and baselining risk. And I think that this concern is very well placed. The question here is, will the carbon project actually deliver on their plan? And if they don't, what is the end buyer here to do? On baselining risks, we have seen many projects, especially many IFM projects, take extremely aggressive assumptions with sharply declining baselines, especially in the beginning of the project, which allows them to issue large volumes of avoidance credits. Now, this poses a real risk of overcrediting, and it is not just a reputational issue, but it is also a very real issue if a rating agency such as Renoster then gives it a bad rating. So this kind of problem should be caught by the buyer at the time of due diligence, and they should probably not invest in these projects at all. More interesting is instead the case of a dynamic baseline, because there the risk doesn't really depend on the project assumptions, but it also depends on what is happening in the areas around the project and the control plots that are used to determine that baseline. And well, this risk here, even if the project has taken some reasonable assumptions, there is still some variability that needs to be taken care of, and this can be diversified away, as we have seen on the slide before. And the other side of the LinkedIn poll talked about modeling risks. So this is basically the question, is the growth model that the project has used too aggressive? Now, many projects that we have seen time and again have some very vague plans, or plans that they do not follow in practice. And well, this kind of risk is again a risk that needs to be caught up at due diligence and simply not invested into. So there are some well-run projects, if you want, that have well-designed projects that have much better assumptions, and for those, a carbon credit buyer ideally would want to buy from a project that is already well established and that maybe has already issued and has proven their assumptions in their issuance. However, buying from these projects is a bit like finding a white whale. They exist, but they are all sold out. So what is a buyer to do? There are several projects out there that are new projects that are waiting for off-takers in order to get started. These are extremely risky, though, because many of them fail, as we have seen even quite lately in the news. So the answer here is that the buyer should take as little of this risk as possible and buy from more experienced developers, do a thorough due diligence on the projects, get external opinions as well on the projects from raters such as Renoster, and maybe even get the assurance of an insurance company that they will insure that project once the forest is well established. Hopefully, in the next few years, as more well-designed projects come online, we will have less and less of this problem.
Thank you for that. Elias, a lot to unpack there. Happy to take it, start wherever you'd like.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with all of it. I think if we're just looking at like by the numbers of new projects that we've rated in the last, let's say 12 to 24 months, the biggest risk is still additionality in baselines. It's still like kind of overstating claims of what's going on inside the project. Claudio, you touched on it. Like IFM projects typically will make bold claims about what's about to happen next year, if not for this project. Well, maybe if they've been managing the land for the last 50 years, you have to wonder why it hasn't happened already. Yeah, I mean, I think that the reason I think this is kind of understated, despite it being the most talked about thing in the carbon markets, is that I do think that there's kind of a push by the carbon markets to make people think that these kind of things have been fixed. And to some extent they have. Like some of the newer methodologies do go a very long way to improving the baselines. But there's still plenty of challenges out there. So whenever you're looking at a project, really the first and primary question I would say is, was this activity really going to happen? You know, is there some other mechanism that would have caused this activity to happen? Really think it over in terms of like where it is in space and what other people are doing. In terms of overstated risk, maybe I'll jump in with a controversial one. I think fire to some extent is overstated. It's a very, very real risk. I don't want to downplay that, but it's also kind of top of everybody's mind. Everyone immediately thinks like, okay, nature-based projects, fire. So yeah, I think that we have to consider, like, there's a lot of nuance around fire. Some forests are not very susceptible to burning at all. You haven't heard too much about fires in Michigan or in New Brunswick, Canada, and that's because these forests are fairly secure from fire. A lot of forests need to burn as part of their ecological means of refreshing themselves. So just because you hear fire doesn't mean it's necessarily bad. And then, you know, forests can recover from fire, and many forest types are fairly resilient to it. And I guess like when we look at the 300 or so projects that we've evaluated, we can only find 8 that have actually had like really big fires in them. Now, maybe that is I mean, in terms of percentages for an insurer, maybe that is a little high, but like realistically speaking, it's not the end all and only risk that you should be considering here. I have some other fun ones too. I guess we could keep going here. I think that people often understate the risks of ARR or reforestation projects in the tropics. And I think there's a couple of reasons for that. The first is that our models in these areas are not that great. So a lot of the time we don't really know how to do the reforestation very well, or how the trees are going to grow very well. Unfortunately, forest science has been kind of dominated by the wealthy nations in like the global north. And so that kind of leaves a lot of uncertainty about like how fast are the trees really going to grow. And then, you know, drought and competition can make it very difficult to do this work a lot of the time. And this is why I often say like it's better to keep a forest intact than to start over, because it's quite difficult to compete with low vegetation that may be like trying to outcompete your native trees. Many native trees that we really value aren't evolved to grow in full sunlight conditions, so they can be very difficult to establish. And then, you know, droughts can come along and do a lot of damage. So, I mean, I think if we look at like native reforestation as a whole, we see a lot of interest in it today. If we look at some of the older projects out there that have been doing it for like decades now, a lot of them are very successful, but they maybe haven't been as successful as they first thought they would be, or maybe they had to replant quite a lot. And then I would always encourage people to consider what the incentives are from the landowner's point of view. So what I mean by this is really consider how the incentives might shift over the multiple decades of the carbon project. And maybe if we do revisit ARR again, let's remember that you need a lot of money up front. Then you get a lot of credits immediately as the trees grow in, you know, a 5 to 15 year period. And then as the time goes on for the project, you end up with trees that are very large and potentially very valuable, and your credit issuance kind of trickles off. And so this is another risk I think that's out there that people haven't necessarily considered, which is that these contracts are very long, and a lot of the time the incentives are really upfront. What are people going to do 40 years from now when they're not being paid very much money to keep these forests intact? And it's the case for IFM projects as well, because you do see that very big upfront flush of cash. And then you really have to wonder, well, these are 100-year projects sometimes. Are people going to be really caring about this in 80 years, given that they got paid most of their money 80 years ago? So anyway, those are just some things to think about in terms of like overstated, understated, I guess.
Thank you for that. I feel like that's one point that maybe doesn't get enough attention in the DCM. What happens after these projects are done, and are the communities incentivized enough to really look after the projects and ensure their success long-term after the project wraps? So we touched on it, but we'd love to dig in a little bit more. Maybe Claudio, start with you. discuss different ways buyers are de-risking their carbon investments and maybe some useful tools or processes that they can incorporate during their due diligence phase to make sure they really understand the potential risks of a project.
Yeah. So buyers today do basically 4 things to de-risk their projects. The first is simple. They do due diligence on the projects they will buy into. So they gather the relevant data, a bit like we do hazard assessments, and try to understand what the risk of the project is. The second thing they do is they do some internal diversification, which is a good thing. So they don't buy into one project, they buy into a few projects. And they could even, if they are sophisticated enough, they could even start modeling the correlations and the risks in order to optimize, let's say, their portfolio, a bit like an insurer does in a much bigger scale. Then another thing they do is that they contractually try to push risks onto the seller or the developer, and then they also buffer internally by overbuying on the project. Now, the first 2 are so it is due diligence and some internal diversification are appropriate risk management tools. Whereas the third and the fourth, which is trying to pushing the risk onto the seller and overbuying to buffer internally, they are quite ineffective as a risk management tool, and I will explain why. Pushing the risk contractually on the seller can work, but it only works up to a certain point because it doesn't really solve the underlying problem. Somebody at a certain point will need to do something about this risk. And overbuying to buffer internally is quite ineffective because a single buyer cannot possibly reach the scale that we were seeing on the page that I showed before that will properly diversify the risks and especially will have a significant impact for those rare cases where you have a big loss, and those are clearly the most important ones. The obvious solution here is to use a professional external party, such as an insurer, that can create a well-diversified portfolio and take on that risk for them, and also can put in some risk capital to take care of the residual risk that is remaining. As an aside, buffer pools, registry buffer pools say they do this, but actually they don't. To do this, you need a proper actuarial calculation and you need risk capital. In other words, you basically need to be a licensed insurer. And indeed, insurance does this in other sectors and has been doing this for centuries. And there's been insurance regulators that have made sure that those insurers stay solvent and are able to pay their claims. So I hope that this can grow also in the carbon sector and can be a tool that appropriately manages the risk instead of people having to internally build their buffers.
Beautiful. And Elias, what are you seeing in terms of ratings and diligence work? Where do you think buyers can maybe make some improvements or?
Well, use Redoster. I mean, I guess, yeah, we see a lot of diligence firms and options out there, and that's very good. Unfortunately, it does cost a lot of money, and it's kind of unfortunate that we have this very complicated and difficult VBB system that nobody really trusts, and so they have to pay twice as much money to another third-party diligence firm to trust it. But anyway, that's kind of just philosophizing here. I mean, in terms of a buyer, I think we hit the nail on the head. There's maybe 3 things you can do to de-risk that people have historically considered. You can do a lot of diligence through a firm like Redoster or others. You can buy insurance, which is a really great way of de-risking. Or, there is this idea of diversification. And here is where I kind of have a more controversial take on this, which is that my opinion is that from a buyer perspective, diversification is not the best move, at least in terms of buying a lot of carbon projects. And the reason for that is that as a buyer, your biggest risk is reputational most of the time. Most of the time, you're doing this carbon offsetting for reputational reasons. And if something goes wrong in any of your projects, be it 1 project or be it 20 projects, you're going to get splashed all over the Guardian article, the Guardian or Bloomberg Green or whatever it is. And nobody's really going to have the nuance to know Well, they had a very diversified portfolio, and this project only represented 3% of it. So diversification, it's actually kind of, I would argue that you should probably not be diversifying as a buyer. What I would argue for is spending a lot of time really getting to know a couple of very good projects. You know, put a lot of effort into actually like understanding how those projects work, and you know, maybe visit them and whatnot. Pick those really good ones that you really trust, and then get insurance on top of that. Because one of the nice things about insurance is that it can handle the diversification that you can't. So from a carbon perspective, it does make sense to diversify. But if your real concern is maybe reputational risk, then the best thing to do is pass off that diversification on the carbon end to an insurer and maintain the lowest possible diversification for reputational risk. So this is a fairly controversial take, I would say. But yeah, I guess.
Yeah, I feel like we were speaking about that in depth a while. Oh, sorry, Claudio. Go
Yeah,
ahead.
if I may
if you have more
rejoin,
to add. Please.
sorry, I completely agree, and I think that an insurer or some other professional entity should be doing the real diversification that that involves 50 or so projects at least. And if an individual buyer does it, I mean, they will also build a lot of operational complexity internally because they have to follow each project. And I completely agree with Elias on the number of projects that somebody should invest in. That should be a single-digit number of projects, maybe a low single-digit number of projects. That is, it shouldn't be just one, because if you invest in just one and then something happens to it, then that can really put all of your offsetting strategy in a bad light. But absolutely, if you invest in very few, do extremely deep due diligence, get external support on it too, because you're just investing in a few and investing significant amounts, then maybe get insurance. I think that even if something happens to one of those few projects that you invested in, you anyway have a good story then for your stakeholders, because you can say, well, all carbon projects are risky, but I did the proper risk management on it. I went out and got insurance. And actually, you know, the insurance has allowed me to at least keep the carbon impact of the project intact. And the projects are anyway risky. So, so you need to find a way to manage this risk.
Yeah, I guess looking back on what I just said, I mean, it sounds quite cynical to say that like you need to be most worried about your reputation, and like if you buy 20 projects, you're going to end up on the Guardian and stuff. But I would also keep in mind that like a lot of your offsetting program probably depends on your reputation. So a lot of people have canceled their offsetting program or walked it back a lot because one of their 20 projects got called out. So it does actually loop back on the carbon itself. So yeah, pick them, but spend a lot of time making sure that you pick the right ones. So
that's a conversation we had recently internally, and I think everyone's familiar with the idea of diversification from a financial perspective, and it makes sense to reduce risk in that way. But it is true, if you're investing in 10, 15, 20 projects, that's just an insane amount of diligence and research to handle. And especially for smaller companies that may not have a large in-house team, it's a lot of work. So it also streamlines their diligence, their procurement, and allows you to go deeper and build relationships with developers that you know and trust. We'd love to look at the developer perspective a little bit. It seems like what's most important to them is getting capital to get these pilot projects off the ground and then scale from there. So how can developers basically do the upfront work to make their projects more bankable, de-risk them, and just make it easier for buyers to get involved? Claudio, if you want to begin, and then Elias.
What do developers often do today? They bit like what end buyers do. They might build a bit of internal buffer. They might undersell. They won't sell all of the credits that they expect to generate into their offtake. So there goes another buffer. So you have the buyer with a buffer, the seller with a buffer, or the developer with a buffer. Sometimes there is an intermediary in the middle, and they will too put in a buffer. And in the end, this is all extremely inefficient. Up to maybe 40, 50% of the credits are tied into these internal buffers. And this really delays and slows down the impact of financing into the carbon space. So basically, the solution here is really for a developer to try to externalize this idiosyncratic risk, and insurance is a potential solution there to help them. Insurance can also help them simply by helping them assess the risks, because that gives them an external view on what are the most important things that they need to be careful about, and how to properly do the risk management of their project. And not just insurers, but actually rating agencies like Renoster are also on the front line in providing good information to the projects themselves. One other thing is that if a project has good risk management, this not only does it help them attract off-takers, but it also helps them attract financing that is more risk averse, which is also more cheap and more abundant. So, for example, we're speaking to several banks which are very interested in entering into the voluntary market space and provide financing, but to do so, they require the sophisticated risk management tools, such as insurance. So basically, what developers can do is, on the one hand, attract more, do better risk management so that it can attract more off-takers, but they can also attract cheaper and more abundant financing.
Elias?
I don't have quite as eloquent an answer. I would say, I would say, as a developer, just prep for every question imaginable. It's always good to just have every single thing that could be asked of you or go wrong in a nice structure already that is very easy to reference, be it for an off-taker or for a diligence firm. Share as much information as you think possible. I think we're still in the situation in the industry where a lot of people are fairly secretive of information that really doesn't impact anybody. But the more that you are willing to share in your public documentation, the less you risk like raising people's eyebrows or having people wanting to dig deeper and whatnot. Yeah, like I said, that's a much more topical answer, but.
Just a quick reminder to everyone, if you have any questions, please drop them in the Q&A. We have one or two more questions we'll discuss, and then it's a free-for-all to take it where you guys would like to explore. Just on that topic of transparency, Elias, and would love for your perspective, Claudio, as well. What are some issues when you're doing diligence or reviews on projects? Where are you seeing diligence lacking, or excuse me, transparency lacking in documentation? And what do you think, like, where should transparency be in the next 5-10 years to really speed up diligence for buyers and just improve the market overall?
One of the things that trends that I'm starting to see that I kind of like is that more and more registries are kind of developing tools to do the numbers for people. And now this is still a minority of carbon projects out there, but a lot of registry, like Ecosystem Restoration Standard and Climate Action Reserve and whatnot, they have really simple tools or software that you just put the numbers in and they compute like everything basically for you. And that makes it very easy to evaluate these projects. So I hope that is one element of transparency that continues. There are still like pretty fundamental like transparency bits that are missing. And I would say like the goal should be that people should be able to basically replicate your numbers. That's the scientific standard that science holds itself to, and you are making a public claim that is scientific in basis. And so that generally means understanding your carbon stock and understanding your sampling techniques and understanding, where your project is still a mystery sometimes. Many, we've done a survey of Vera and Gold Standard and whatnot, and many projects on those registries still don't even tell you where they are in a public context. So yeah, and then I think the gold standard for transparency that we really like to see, that almost always results in higher ratings, is really revealing the inner details of these projects in terms of budgets or in terms of where the money is going. This is very reassuring to us because it really shows that you planned this stuff out very professionally and that if you have a balanced budget ahead of time, that's a major de-risking factor, and we can look over the budget and see if it's realistic. So there are a handful of projects that are just that transparent, and they are our favorites, to be sure.
Yes, and from my side, I absolutely second that. We see a lot of projects with a lot of problems. So with these vague plans, they might say, we will plant a mix of local species, but then they don't say which local species, they don't say what the mix is, they don't show the detailed carbon calculations. They use growth curves that were established in a completely different geography and environment. So here, the fundamental question that we would like to see answered is really how much carbon was or will actually be captured, and we want to know the how and see how you calculate this in detail. There are another couple of questions where we often need several interactions with a developer in order to understand exactly what the project is doing. In general, we have a question about whether there is a reputational risk on how the project is being run. So what is happening in the local community, and are there some risks to the local community, and what about the local ecosystem, and is that coming under risk from the project? The other thing is the project here to stay? And one important way to understand if the project is here to stay is to see the financials of the project, because we want to understand what is the financial stability of the developer and what is their motivation to also remain managing the project after the project crediting period has ended, and they don't really have any more money to make, but they still need to maintain the project up and running. And then finally, one thing that we see very little of is how is the project managing the risks, and that too is something, especially the long-term risks, which we find quite missing in the current documentation, but also in the requirements that are coming from the standards. We see very little about climate change, for example. That analysis that I showed you before, for us, is quite relevant in understanding what is the outlook on a project in the long term. And this we don't really see in the documentation, and really have to dig with a project developer to get.
And that was one question that had come through LinkedIn as well. Would love to hear both of your perspectives about how both buyers and developers should plan and build in climate change to their risk models and project design. What are some key considerations that for either buyers or developers that you think should be taken into account?
So from our side, I mean, we already have quite sophisticated models that tell us what the climate change is going to be locally. So that is something that I think that you need to consider, and that is something that we absolutely model. But what are the changing weather patterns in the local area of the project? And what are you doing about it? Because several of them can in some way be mitigated. And this is something that the project, we think, really needs to think about, plan, and communicate well. So I don't know, they need to future-proof with more resilient species. They need to do fire prevention, irrigation plans. And yes, and this ideally we would want not only the projects to proactively come out with this kind of information, but also the standards to take a much more serious look at what is happening in the project area predicted by the climate change models.
Elias, anything to add on that from the science perspective?
No, I just hope that there's more kind of pre-baked tools that are being developed out there to help folks. I think that I think it's quite challenging for developers right now to meet the latest and greatest science, especially if they're kind of a small group that's just planting trees in some part of the world. And so I do have a lot of sympathy for them, and there are groups out there that are offering kind of some of the latest scientific stuff at a high price. So I hope that in the coming years, we'll see kind of more public releases of tool sets that people can use to actually use the best science in their projects.
Great. So we'll move into some of the questions we received from LinkedIn and also the Q&A here. If you guys have any others, please put them in. Claudio, for you, can you speak a little bit more about payment in kind with carbon credits and why that may be better than cash?
Yeah, so there's nothing wrong with payment in cash. First of all, it's really great if a project already insures themselves and gets the payment in cash. There are some risks in receiving a cash payment, especially in several years into the future. We don't know in the future what the credit price will be. We don't know in the future even if credits of similar quality, and let's say high enough quality, will even be available in the market. So the moment you have a claim, and so you need some kind of compensation, you need that compensation because you're replacing some credits that have gone missing. And if you receive a certain amount of cash that was established back when the policy was first written, that will help you buy credits in the market, but you don't know if you will find the right amount of credits and if you will find the right quality of credits. A model such as ours instead has what happens is that we immediately go out and buy credits or enter into an offtake agreement the moment we receive the premium from the customer, the moment we enter into the contract. So we avoid all the price risk and availability risk that is there when instead you have an insurance that pays out in cash. That is the key to it.
Great. And for both of you, maybe Elias, if you want to start, how can we address risks of social ecological trade-offs of carbon projects?
I mean, these are classically the hardest things to actually evaluate. Obviously, just having budgetary information very clearly laid out and to see where the money is going is probably the best way of assuring that things are being done well. But there's a whole suite of governance best practices that we look for when we're evaluating these risks. It includes, like, is there an on-the-ground presence? Is the money being distributed by like a group of people who are democratically elected or competent in this kind of thing? And then obviously it does scale. It's not necessarily right to point to like one small landowner in the US and say that, like, oh, well, you don't have an enormous amount of social co-benefits. So I don't think that every project needs to come with a massive amount of social benefit to it. I think there is validity in planting trees and removing carbon dioxide without that. But certainly every project taking place on community land or with some sort of community history should have that component. But yeah, this is, I would argue, without doubt, this is one of the hardest things that we actually do try to assess. And it can be very difficult to get to the bottom of, especially in a project that hasn't started yet.
Claudio, how are you thinking about those potential trade-offs?
Yes, I mean, we hope it's not a trade-off in the sense that what we want to see is projects that have a social ecological benefit, which is not just coming from the carbon. Actually, if a project is designed in such a way, this makes the project more permanent, because the reason the project is there, which might be driven by the carbon income, isn't just because of the carbon income. There is more to it, which is the benefit that it brings to the local community. In fact, if a project is there only for the carbon income, that puts it a bit on a flimsy ground, because if suddenly the price of carbon credits collapses, maybe the project doesn't become viable anymore. So the way we are looking at it is from a design perspective, we really value a project that has also some, that isn't making a trade-off, but is rather in a win-win situation also on the social ecological front.
One other question here from Tristan. How do we fix the issues with protocols and methodologies that are in the crediting process leading to uncertainties and misestimations? For example, a baseline or estimation of sequestered carbon over time. Maybe Elias, if you want to start with that.
My strategy has just been to yell about it on YouTube, which I think does work a little bit. But I think that when developing these methodologies or looking at them, we have to be very critical of how they could be misapplied. And I don't mean misapplied necessarily in terms of like people with sinister intent, but like what statistical phenomenon could arise that could lead to overissuance. And one common theme I see in a lot of methodologies is methodologies that give project developers choices for how to do things, A, B, or C for your baseline, A, B, or C for your measuring your trees, are inherently flawed because one of those choices may be better than another, or one of those choices may be more expensive than another. But what ultimately ends up happening is that a methodology that doesn't give any choices, none of those projects will ever get the actual true estimate of carbon particularly well. But if it doesn't give any choices, usually the overall average amount of credits being issued on the methodology is fine, because you'll have some projects that overcredit and some projects that undercredit. When you have methodologies that give people choices, anytime that you have a project that undercredits, they're going to choose to do something that like gets them to the right number. And this is a very bizarre concept around called a statistical theory called the central limit theorem. But essentially, if you have a methodology that like gives people multiple avenues, you are always optimizing for overissuance, because there's never really going to be a situation where somebody takes an undercredit, some project gets undercredited. Maybe this is too complex for this webinar here, but anyway, that's one of the ways that I look at these methodologies is and asking like, what choices and what incentives do they arise to, regardless of whether or not people are behaving properly.
And Claudio, I'm curious how you're thinking about risk from a methodological perspective.
Yeah. In a sense, if so methodologies are evolving, and we're trying to improve them and to make more and more certain that the ton sequestered is really the ton sequestered. So the easy answer to this is don't invest in credits that are on old methodologies. But I think that this is not the right way to go, because there are plenty of good projects on older methodologies that have taken sufficiently conservative assumptions so that we're pretty certain. Say that Rhinoceros has given it a good rating. I think that is there must be good evidence that the ton that they are claiming to have sequestered, they have really sequestered it. So my answer to this would be, if the methodology leaves some space for uncertainty, certainly not the option that Elias was talking about, that also for me is a no-no. But if there is some uncertainty, the project itself can at that point make the more conservative choice, let's say do the right thing and communicate it. And that for us is a big plus to invest in that particular project. So an older project on an older methodology that has taken some conservative assumptions for us is just as good as a newer project on a newer methodology that maybe has taken a thinner margin. Actually, you might even argue that it's better, especially if the vintage is older, because they have sequestered the carbon some time ago, and that has had more time to have significant impact on the climate.
There is a lot of positive things to be said for old projects. That being one of them, we do know from a scientific perspective, removing carbon in the past is more important than removing carbon today. But then also, if you have an old project on an old methodology that's been working very well for a long time, that's a much lower risk than a brand new one that's planting trees that hasn't even started yet. So yeah, I often encourage people to find good old projects.
I think that's a point that maybe gets lost in the conversations around the VCM, especially with the focus on most recent vintages and newer methodologies. Yes, it's important to resolve any issues and improve the science and quantification, but quality projects from years back definitely have more climate impact overall. There's a question here which may be interesting. The impact of the Trump tariffs on the VCM from Misha. I hope I pronounced that right. I doubt the importation of credits themselves is subject to tariffs, maybe. Rather, tariffs might have second order effects. For example, as margins come under pressure, elective budget lines like offset purchases get axed. How does this affect ARR projects, and how can developers address them? I know that might be a lot to unpack, but if either of you have any thoughts on that.
Well, from the outside of the United States perspective, if I may give it, the US is an important buyer of carbon credits in the VCM. There is no doubt. And if there are economic uncertainties because of a moment of transition, then yes, large corporates might scale back on their purchase of carbon credits from the VCM market, and that can have a depressing effect on the market as a whole. However, there are other countries that are instead sticking very much to the strategy that they have developed in the past years. The EU is very much continuing on its path. Switzerland, where I'm based, has just passed a law that requests all companies basically to be net zero by 2050 and to show it in a plan with a first touch point, with a first measurement in 2030. I hear also Japan is still doing a lot, even China. So if I am a US-based developer and I find that the market has slowed down a little in the US, I would right now look abroad a little. And as far as I know, from the EU and from Switzerland, there aren't any tariffs on carbon credits. So that would be my advice. Would be it is hopefully just a transitory phase, and there are other markets that maybe can be appropriate to sell into.
Yeah, I don't know if tariffs affect carbon credits. I don't imagine they do because they're like digital assets, but who knows? I guess obviously a recession is bad for a voluntary market that's driven by it's a little bit of a luxury to some extent. But I guess maybe if I can focus on a couple rays of hope. While a recession would be bad, I would say historically under Republican presidents, the voluntary carbon market's done very well. And the reason for that is that I think there's a sense in private industry that the government isn't doing anything. And there's often kind of a social backlash to the ecologically unfriendly practices of a conservative government. So we've seen the voluntary carbon market thrive under the first Trump administration and then thrive under the Bush administration, even if you go back that far. So there is that. And then not related to the carbon markets, but Trump has made a lot of noise about cutting down all of the U.S. forests, trees. And I would kind of assure people there that the U.S. forest industry doesn't operate with like 50% spare capacity. Like we're operating at capacity. And so Trump can't just wave a wand and immediately cut down 50% of our forest. It would take a very long time for mill capacity and worker capacity to actually like get to that point. So I do think to some extent, the U.S. forests are a little safer than we could be thinking if we're just looking at the headlines.
And a question from Todd Farrington regarding long-term alignment of interests. I believe you mentioned that, Elias. How do you think about projects based on private land ownership, not leasing but owning, that uses mixed models, revenue from carbon complemented by sustainable harvesting of high-value timber in later periods, to keep interests aligned over the long term for permanence?
Yeah, we're very big fans of alternative revenue streams and of long-term wood products. The best forest management, particularly in the United States, is done with some sort of active approach. And that can be both in terms of productivity, but then also in terms of ecological benefits. Especially, we're looking at a lot of we're looking at a lot of reforestation projects these days that are really just kind of planting the trees and just walking away. And that's not necessarily the best way to regenerate a native forest, because a lot of the time you do want to do some sort of like commercial thinning that is both beneficial from a timber perspective and also pushes the forest into a more old growth looking ecological state that's more uneven aged. Yeah, I guess the drawback to mixed revenue streams is that sometimes it does pose an additionality question. So if you are earning revenue off the project from timber in addition to the project, that immediately does raise the question of like, could you have done this project? Could you have done this without the actual carbon credit? So is the revenue enough? So that is going to be a complicating factor, which we have to assess as a review agency or whatnot. And so as a project developer, I would advise you obviously to run those numbers and make that case very like ironclad. But and then yeah, I guess this is most applicable usually to IFM, but we have certainly seen ARR and Red Plus projects that also have alternative revenue streams from timber that we're completely supportive of.
And if I may add a little to this, the way we see it is that for developers, it's a very good thing. So that just makes their project more resilient. And if they can show that it wouldn't have happened without the carbon credits, then there isn't really much of a question of additionality. For buyers, I think it is a little more of a mixed bag. And the risk is this: the different revenue streams give the developer some optionality on choosing one or the other, or maybe on focusing more on one or the other, depending on their market outlook. So say that they have a significant harvesting component, and then the price of timber goes up, they decide to harvest more and deliver less into their carbon credit offtakes. Now, clearly, this needs to be avoided. And so what we want to see in this kind of project is some clear guardrails, let's say, that hold the developer steady on the generation of carbon credits.
Excellent.
But
anything else to add to that?
no, but otherwise,
Okay.
we also believe it's a very good thing because it makes the projects more resilient.
Yeah, I've heard that from a number of buyers and investors too, that some of them, based on their particular strategy, prefer projects with more diverse revenue streams because of that resiliency that you mentioned. Claudio, question here for you. Claudio suggests insurance manages risk via pooled risk mitigation. How does this approach actually differ from a registry buffer pool approach? And I'd encourage everyone who's curious about buffer pool to read the white paper. It's very informative and dives into this in detail. But would love both of your perspectives on this, maybe to close out.
Sure. So the answers are indeed all in that white paper, and they're discussed in the webinar. The registry buffer pool is not completely useless. It is a first layer of protection for that can absorb certain parts of risk. But there are several issues with them. One, the first being that it has just an upfront contribution. Now, that it is, as an insurer, I can tell you, no insurer will accept that you pay a premium for, that will cover you for the next 20 to 30 years, because you have no idea where the risk will go. And the risk might increase, the risk might decrease, but it is absolutely impossible from an actuarial perspective to properly calculate the premium that needs to be paid all up front, as the registry buffer pools are requiring. And indeed, they probably require too little. There has been scientific studies, for example, on the California's buffer pool, that it is basically already depleted and it needs to last for another 80 years or so. So that is not really the way to go to build this portfolio of diversified projects, and then add the risk capital and properly calculate. You really need to have some kind of regular premium that you pay, which is clearly much smaller than that initial contribution that is asked by the buffer pools, but that is eminently affordable. I mean, you've seen the prices that I quoted before. They are in line with what is asked, for example, to insure buildings for large corporates. And I mean, 1% of the value of the credit is something that also intuitively is affordable. The other problem is that they have no risk capital, which means that they cannot really absorb that systematic risk that I was showing you before. You need somebody to put money there and maybe try to earn a bit of return on that money, but that will take that risk, because that risk just cannot be diversified. So registry buffer pools cannot possibly be diversifying that. And unless they put some risk capital, it means they cannot possibly be absorbing it. And thirdly, we would like to see a lot more transparency in how these buffer pools are managed. Quite frankly, they need to be a bit like insurers have an auditor look through their reserves, look through the processes with which they manage the reserves and their claims. We would need to see basically the same thing in registry buffer pools. So in order to properly absorb the risk as a registry, they need to do all the same things that insurers are required to do.
Yeah, I know we're out of
Elias?
time. I don't know if you want me to answer.
Yeah,
I mean, this is
let's go
probably my
another
most
minute or two.
controversial answer in this whole call, which is that buffer pools are not a real thing. Like they don't really exist as far as I'm concerned. And I'll give you a couple of reasons for why that's the case. The first is that historically speaking, they don't pay out. Like they really don't seem to. There's a number of these projects that have experienced reversals or have been demonstrated through like ironclad scientific arguments that they're not doing what they say they're doing. And registries, particularly Vera and the American Carbon Registry, have not paid out their buffer pool. Why don't they pay out? Well, they're not big enough to pay out for all the things that have gone wrong. Vera's buffer pool, I think last I checked, was 75 million credits. Kariba alone, which is obviously the big project that had a big scandal in Africa, I think it's something like 32 million credits. So that's you know, almost half of the buffer pool was eaten up by a single project, but we can all sit here and rattle off many, many more Vera projects that are in deep reversal. So what happens instead of the buffer pool actually paying out? Vera puts projects on hold forever. Vera doesn't verify projects. There are a number of REDD Plus projects that are completely deforested at this point, or at least their crediting area is. And you know, they've never actually like re-verified, and they're never really going to fess up. So what we're witnessing here in the carbon markets today is a crisis of confidence in the carbon markets because the buffer pool doesn't exist and it doesn't pay out. Because everyone knows if something goes wrong in your project, you're probably not going to be compensated for it. Everyone knows if like Thales West creates a new paper about the new methodology, then you're out of luck because they didn't compensate you last time. So insurance is very different and very important because obviously there are these legal mechanisms that require both that the insurance be, you know, really hold sufficient numbers of credits or hold a sufficient amount of capital, but also that they pay out, legally speaking. So I think that's really the key to improving the system. I mentioned ACR too. You know, ACR's buffer pool, they allow projects to buy other people's credits to put into their buffer pool. So ACR allows you to buy some zombie credit from like 10 years ago to insert for your buffer. So ACR's buffer pool is like consists of mostly zombie credits from projects that are long dead. So this is a major problem, a major conflict of interest in the carbon markets that's being addressed by private insurance.
Well, thank you both, Claudio and Elias, and thank you everyone for joining. That concludes our webinar today. We'll be sending a follow-up email with a few resources, and please feel free to reach out, and have a wonderful day, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks.